The reading is from the Life and Passion of Saint Cyprian, the Bishop and Martyr, by Pontius his deacon. Part 2. I omit many other matters, and indeed many important ones, which the necessity of a limited space does not permit to be detailed in more lengthened discourse, and concerning which this much is sufficient to have been said. But if the Gentiles could have heard these things as they stood before the rostrum, they would probably at once have believed. What then should a Christian people do, whose very name proceeds from faith? Thus the ministrations are constantly distributed according to the quality of the men and their degrees. Many who, by the straitness of poverty, were unable to manifest the kindness of wealth, manifested more than wealth, making up by their own labor a service dearer than all riches. And under such a teacher, who would not press forward to be found in some part of such a warfare, whereby he might please both God the Father and Christ the Judge, and for the present so excellent a priest. Thus what is good was done in the liberality of overflowing works to all men, not to those only who are of the household of faith. Something more was done than is recorded of the incomparable benevolence of Tobias. He must forgive, and forgive again, and frequently forgive, or, to speak more truly, he must of right concede that, although very much might be done before Christ, yet that something more might be done after Christ, since to his times all fullness is attributed. Tobias collected together those who were slain by the king and cast out, of his own race only. Banishment followed these actions, so good and so benevolent, for impiety always makes this return, that it repays the better with the worse. And what God's priest replied to the interrogation of the proconsul, there are acts which relate. In the meantime, he is excluded from the city, who had done some good for the city's safety. He who had striven that the eyes of the living should not suffer the horrors of the infernal abode. He, I say, who, vigilant in the watches of benevolence, had provided, O wickedness, with unacknowledged goodness, that when all were forsaking the desolate appearance of the city, a destitute state, and a deserted country should not perceive its many exiles. But let the world look to this, which accounts banishment a penalty. To them their country is too dear, and they have the same name as their parents. But we abhor even our parents themselves, if they would persuade us against God. To them it is a severe punishment to live outside their own city. To the Christian, the whole of this world is one home. Wherefore, though he was banished into a hidden and secret place, yet associated with the affairs of his God, he cannot regard it as an exile. In addition, while honestly serving God, he is a stranger even in his own city. For while the continency of the Holy Spirit restrains him from carnal desires, he lays aside the conversation of the former man, and even among his fellow citizens, or I might almost say, among the parents themselves of his earthly life, he is a stranger. Besides, although this might otherwise appear to be a punishment, yet in causes and sentences of this kind, which we suffer for the trial of the proof of our virtue, it is not a punishment, because it is a glory. But indeed, suppose banishment not to be a punishment to us, yet the witness of their own conscience may still attribute the last and worst wickedness to those who can lay upon the innocent what they think to be a punishment. I will not now describe a charming place, and for the present I pass over the addition of all possible delights. Let us conceive of the place, filthy in situation, squalid in appearance, having no wholesome water, no pleasantness of verdure, no neighboring shore, but vast wooden rocks, between the inhospitable jaws of a totally deserted solitude, far removed in the pathless regions of the world. Such a place might have borne the name of exile, if Cyprian, the priest of God, had come thither, although to him, if the ministrations of men had been wanting, either birds, as in the case of Elias, or angels, as in that of Daniel, would have ministered. Away with the belief that anything would be wanting to the least of us, so long as he stands for the confession of the name. So far was God's pontiff, who had always been urgent in merciful works, from needing the assistance of all these things. And now let us return with thankfulness to what I had suggested in the second place, that for the soul of such a man there was divinely provided a sunny and suitable spot, a dwelling, secret as he wished, and all that he has before been promised to be added to those who seek the kingdom and righteousness of God, and not to mention the number of the brethren who visited him, and then the kindness of the citizens themselves, which supplied to him everything whereof he appeared to be deprived. I will not pass over God's wonderful visitation, whereby he wished his priest in exile to be so certain of his passion that was to follow, and in his full confidence of the threatening martyrdom, Cherubis possessed not only an exile, but a martyr too. For on that day, whereon we first abode in the place of banishment, for the condescension of his love, had chosen me among his household companions to a voluntary exile, would that he could also have chosen me to share his passion. There appeared to me, said he, ere yet I was sunk in the repose of slumber, a young man of unusual stature, who, as it were, led me to the praetorium, where I seemed to myself to be led before the tribunal of the proconsul, then sitting. When he looked upon me, he began at once to note down a sentence on his tablet, which I knew not, for he had asked nothing of me with the accustomed interrogation. But the youth, who was standing at his back, very anxiously read what had been noted down, and because he could not then declare it in words, he showed me by an intelligible sign what was contained in the writing of that tablet. For with hand expanded and flattened like a blade, he imitated the stroke of the accustomed punishment, and expressed what he wished to be understood as clearly as by speech. I understood the future sentence of my passion. I began to ask and to beg immediately that a delay of at least 1 day should be accorded me, until I should have arranged my property in some reasonable order. And when I had urgently repeated my entreaty, he began again to note down, I know not what, on his tablet, but I perceived from the calmness of his countenance that the judge's mind was moved by my petition, as being a just one. Moreover, that youth, who already had disclosed to me the intelligence of my passion by gesture rather than by words, hastened to signify repeatedly by secret signal that the delay was granted which had been asked for until the morrow, twisting his fingers one behind the other. And I, although the sentence had not been read, although I rejoiced with very glad heart, with joy at the delay accorded, yet trembled so with fear of the uncertainty of the interpretation, that the remains of fear still set my exulting heart beating with excessive agitation. What could be more plain than this revelation? What could be more blessed than this condescension? Everything was foretold to Cyprian beforehand, which subsequently followed. Nothing was diminished of the words of God. Nothing was mutilated of so sacred a promise. Carefully consider each particular in accordance with its announcement. He asks for delay till the morrow, when the sentence of his passion was under deliberation, begging that he might arrange his affairs on the day which he had thus obtained. This 1 day signified a year, which he was about to pass in the world after his vision. For, to speak more plainly, after the year was expired, he was crowned, on that day on which, at the commencement of the year, the fact had been announced to him. For although we do not read of the day of the Lord as a year in sacred Scripture, yet we regard that space of time as due in making promise of future things. Whence it is of no consequence if, in this case, under the ordinary expression of a day, it is only a year that in this place is implied, because that which is the greater ought to be fuller in meaning. Moreover, that it was explained rather by signs than by speech, was because the utterance of speech was reserved for the manifestation of the time itself. For anything is usually set forth in words, whenever what is set forth is accomplished. For indeed, no one knew why this had been shown to him until afterwards, when on the very day on which he had seen it, he was crowned. Nevertheless, in the meantime, his impending suffering was certainly known to all, but the exact day of his passion was not spoken of by any of the same, just as if they were ignorant of it. And indeed, I find something similar in the Scriptures. For Zacharias the priest, because he did not believe the promise of a son, made to him by angel, became dumb, so that he asked for tablets by a sign, being about to write his son's name rather than utter it. With reason, also in this case, where God's messenger declared the impending passion of his priest rather by signs, he both admonished his faith and fortified his priest. Moreover, the ground of asking for delay arose out of his wish to arrange his affairs and settle his will. Yet what affairs or what will had he to arrange, except ecclesiastical concerns? And thus that last delay was received, in order that whatever had to be disposed of by his final decision concerning the care of cherishing the poor might be arranged. And I think that for no other reason, and indeed for this reason only, indulgence was granted to him even by those very persons who had ejected and were about to slay him, that being at hand, he might relieve the poor also who were before him with the final, or to speak more accurately, with the entire outlay of his last stewardship. And therefore, having so benevolently ordered matters, and so arranged them according to his will, the morrow drew near. Now also a messenger came to him from the city from Xistus, the good and peace-making priest, and on that account most blessed martyr. The coming executioner instantly looked for who should strike through that devoted neck of the most sacred victim, and thus, in the daily expectation of dying, every day was to him as if the crown might be attributed to each. In the meantime, there assembled to him many eminent people, and people of most illustrious rank and family, and noble with the world's distinctions, who, on account of ancient friendship with him, repeatedly urged his withdrawal, and that their urgency might not be in some sort hollow, they also offered places to which he might retire. But he had now set the world aside, having his mind suspended upon heaven, and did not consent to their tempting persuasions. He would perhaps even then have done what was asked for by so many and faithful friends, if it had been bidden him by divine command. But that lofty glory of so great a man must not be passed over without announcement, that now, when the world was swelling, and of its trust in its princes breathing out hatred of the name, he was instructing God's servants, as opportunity was given, in the exhortations of the Lord, and was animating them to tread underfoot the sufferings of this present time by the contemplation of a glory to come hereafter. Indeed, such was his love of sacred discourse, that he wished that his prayers in regard to his suffering might be so answered, that he would be put to death in the very act of speaking about God. And these were the daily acts of a priest destined for a pleasing sacrifice to God, when, behold, at the bidding of the proconsul, the officer with his soldiers on a sudden came unexpectedly upon him, or rather, to speak more truly, they thought that they had come unexpectedly on him at his gardens, I say, which at the beginning of his faith he had sold, and which, being restored by God's mercy, he would assuredly have sold again for the use of the poor, if he had not wished to avoid ill will from the persecutors. But when could a mind ever prepared be taken unawares, as if by an unforeseen attack? Therefore now he went forward, certain that what had been long delayed would be settled. He went forward with a lofty and elevated countenance, manifesting cheerfulness in his look, and courage in his heart. But being delayed to the morrow, he returned from the praetorium to the officer's house, when on a sudden a scattered rumor prevailed throughout all Carthage, that now Theseus was brought forward, whom there was nobody who did not know as well for his illustrious fame in the honorable opinion of all, as on account of the recollection of his most renowned work. On all sides all men were flocking together to a spectacle, to us glorious from the devotion of faith, and to be mourned over even by the Gentiles. A gentle custody, however, had him in charge when taken and placed for one night in the officer's house, so that we, his associates and friends, were as usual in his company. The whole people in the meantime, in anxiety that nothing should be done throughout the night without their knowledge, kept watch before the officer's door. The goodness of God granted him at that time, so truly worthy of it, that even God's people should watch on the passion of the priest. Yet perhaps someone may ask what was the reason of his returning from the praetorium to the officer, and some think that this arose from the fact that for his own part the proconsul was then unwilling. Far be it from me to complain, in matters divinely ordered, of slothfulness or aversion in the proconsul. Far be it from me to admit such an evil into the consciousness of a religious mind, as that the fancy of man should decide the fate of so blessed a martyr. But the morrow, which a year before the divine condescension had foretold, required to be literally the morrow. At last that day dawned, that destined, that promised, that divine day, which if even the tyrant himself had wished to put off, he would not have had any power to do so. The day rejoicing at the consciousness of the future martyr, and, the clouds being scattered throughout the circuit of the world, the day shone upon them with a brilliant sun. He went out from the house of the officer, though he was the officer of Christ and God, and was walled in on all sides by the ranks of a mingled multitude. And such a numberless army hung upon his company, as if they had come with an assembled troop to assault death itself. Now as he went, he had to pass by the race course, and rightly, as if it had been contrived on purpose, he had to pass by the place of a corresponding struggle, who, having finished his contest, was running to the crown of righteousness. But when he had come to the praetorium, as the proconsul had not yet come forth, a place of retirement was accorded him. There, as he sat moistened after his long journey with excessive perspiration, the seat was by chance covered with linen, so that even in the very moment of his passion he might enjoy the honor of the episcopate. One of the officers, who had formerly been a Christian, offered him his clothes, as if he might wish to change his moistened garments for drier ones. And he doubtless coveted nothing further in respect of his proffered kindness than to possess the now blood-stained sweat of the martyr-going God. He made reply to him and said, "We apply medicines to annoyances, which probably today will no longer exist. Is it any wonder that he despised suffering in body, who had despised death in soul? Why should we say more? He was suddenly announced to the proconsul. He is brought forward. He is placed before him. He is interrogated as to his name. He answers who he is, and nothing more. And thus, therefore, the judge reads from his tablet the sentence which lately in the vision he had not read. A spiritual sentence, not rashly to be spoken, a sentence worthy of such a bishop and such a witness, a glorious sentence, wherein he was called a standard-bearer of the sect, and an enemy of the gods, and one who was to be an example to his people, and that with his blood discipline would begin to be established. Nothing could be more complete, nothing more true than this sentence, for all the things which were said, although said by a heathen, are divine. Nor is it indeed to be wondered at, since priests are accustomed to prophesy of the passion. He had been a standard-bearer, who was accustomed to teach concerning the bearing of Christ's standard. He had been an enemy of the gods, who commanded the idols to be destroyed. Moreover, he gave example to his friends, since when many were about to follow in a similar manner, he was the first in the province to consecrate the first fruits of martyrdom, and by his blood discipline began to be established. But it was the discipline of martyrs, who, emulating their teacher, in the imitation of a glory like his own, themselves also gave a confirmation to discipline by the very blood of their own example. And when he left the doors of the praetorium, a crowd of soldiery accompanied him, and that nothing might be wanting in his passion, centurions and tribunes guarded his side. Now the place itself where he was about to suffer is level, so that it affords a noble spectacle, with its trees thickly planted on all sides. But as, by the extent of the space beyond, the view was not attainable to the confused crowd, persons who favored him had climbed up into the branches of the trees, that there might not even be wanting to him what happened in the case of Zacharias, that he was gazed upon from the trees. And now, having with his own hands bound his eyes, he tried to hasten the slowness of the executioner, whose office was to wield the sword, and who with difficulty clasped the blade in his failing right hand with trembling fingers, until the mature hour of glorification strengthened the hand of the centurion with power granted from above to accomplish the death of the excellent man, and at length supplied him with the permitted strength. O blessed people of the Church, who as well in sight as in feeling, and what is more, in outspoken words, suffered with such a bishop as theirs, and as they had ever heard him in his own discourses, were crowned by God the Judge. For although that which the general wish desired could not occur, that the entire congregation should suffer at once in the fellowship of a like glory, yet whoever under the eyes of Christ beholding, and in the hearing of the priest, eagerly desired to suffer, by the sufficient testimony of that desire, did in some sort send a missive to God, as his ambassador. His passion being thus accomplished, it resulted that Cyprian, who had been an example to all good men, was also the first who in Africa imbued his priestly crown with blood of martyrdom, because he was the first who began to be such after the apostles. For from the time at which the episcopal order is enumerated at Carthage, not one is ever recorded, even of good men and priests, to have come to suffering. Although devotion surrendered to God is always in consecrated men reckoned instead of martyrdom, yet Cyprian attained even to the perfect crown by the consummation of the Lord, so that in that very city in which he had in such wise lived, and in which he had been the first to do many noble deeds, he also was the first to decorate the insignia of his heavenly priesthood with glorious gore. What shall I do now? Between joy at his passion and grief at still remaining, my mind is divided in different directions, and twofold affections are burdening a heart too limited for them. Shall I grieve that I was not his associate? But yet I must triumph in his victory. Shall I triumph in his victory? Still I grieve that I am not his companion. Yet still to you I must in simplicity confess, what you are also aware of, that it was my intention to be his companion. Much and excessively I exult at his glory, but still more do I grieve that I remained behind. Thus ends the reading. Glory to Jesus Christ.